The morning mist clung to the Korean mountains like a shroud, but Lieutenant Colonel James Riley Stone knew that beneath the deceptive tranquility, death was stirring. It was April 22nd, 1951, and the 700 men of the 2nd Battalion, Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry Regiment, were about to face their greatest test in the frozen hell of the Korean War. Stone stood on the crest of Hill 677, his weathered hands gripping a pair of binoculars as he surveyed the Kapyong Valley below. The intelligence reports had been troubling. Massive Chinese forces were massing for what military analysts believed would be their largest spring offensive. United Nations forces, stretched thin across the mountainous terrain, were bracing for an assault that could potentially drive them back to the sea. The Canadian position was strategically crucial. Positioned alongside their Commonwealth allies, the 3rd Battalion of the Royal Australian Regiment, the Canadians controlled the southern entrance to the Kapyong Valley. If the Chinese broke through here, they would have a clear path to Seoul, the South Korean capital that had already changed hands multiple times during this brutal conflict. Stone's battalion had arrived in Korea only months earlier. Part of Canada's contribution to the United Nations effort to repel the communist invasion of South Korea, these men, many of whom had never seen combat, were about to face an enemy force that outnumbered them nearly 10-1. The Chinese People's Volunteer Army, battle-hardened from years of civil war, was known for their human wave tactics and their willingness to accept massive casualties to achieve their objectives. As Stone moved through the Canadian positions, he could see his men preparing for what was to come. Private William Foster, barely 19 years old, was checking his rifle for the 3rd time that morning. Sergeant Major Gordon Mackenzie, a veteran of the Second World War, was ensuring that ammunition was properly distributed among the companies. Each soldier knew that the next few hours would determine not just their own fate, but possibly the outcome of the entire Korean campaign. The battalions for Companies Able, Baker, Charlie, and Dog were strategically positioned across the hill's defensive perimeter. Captain Wally Mills commanded Dog Company, positioned on the most exposed flank. Lieutenant Mike Levy, a decorated veteran of the previous World War, led the 10th Platoon in what would soon become the most contested section of the entire battle line. According to reports from the Canadian Encyclopedia, a battalion of roughly 700 Canadian troops helped defend a crucial hill in the front lines of the Korean War against a force of about 5,000 Chinese soldiers. Stone understood that the odds were overwhelmingly against them, but he also knew that the defensive position favored his men. The steep slopes of Hill 677 would force any attacking force to advance uphill under direct fire from well-entrenched Canadian positions as the sun climbed higher. Stone received word that Chinese forces had been spotted moving through the valley below. The enemy was probing, testing the Commonwealth defenses, searching for weaknesses. The battle that military historians would later call one of the most significant Canadian military actions since the Second World War was about to begin. The wireless crackled with reports from Australian positions to the south. Heavy fighting had erupted as Chinese forces launched their first probing attacks. The sound of artillery fire echoed across the valley, and Stone knew that within hours, those same guns would be turned on his own men. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test every aspect of Canadian military training, courage, and determination. The first Chinese shells began falling on Hill 677 at precisely 1400 hours on PT 23rd. The earth shook with thunderous explosions as Lieutenant Colonel Stone's worst fears materialized before his eyes. Through his field glasses, he could see massive columns of Chinese infantry moving through the valley like a brown tide. Their numbers seemingly endless. Captain Wally Mills crouched in his command post, watching his Dog companies forward. Observers called in coordinates for their own artillery response. The Canadian 25-pounder guns, positioned in the rear, began their deadly work, sending shells screaming into the advancing Chinese formations. But for every enemy soldier that fell, two more seemed to take his place. The initial Chinese assault was a textbook example of their human wave tactics. Wave after wave of infantry, supported by mortar fire and heavy machine guns, advanced up the steep slopes of the hill. The Canadians, well entrenched in their defensive positions, met them with disciplined rifle fire and the deadly chatter of their Bren guns. The steep terrain that had seemed like such an advantage was also proving to be a challenge. The Chinese were using every fold in the ground, every rocky outcrop, to advance closer to the Canadian lines. Private William Foster found himself in the thick of the action, his Lenfield rifle growing hot in his hands as he fired at the advancing enemy. Beside him, Corporal Robert Henderson was methodically feeding ammunition belts into their section's Bren gun, the weapon's distinctive sound providing a deadly rhythm to the unfolding battle. The training they had received in Canada seemed like a lifetime ago as they faced the reality of combat against a determined and skilled enemy. Lieutenant Mike Levy's 10th platoon held the most exposed position on the entire perimeter. A veteran of the Italian campaign during the Second World War, Levy had seen combat before, but nothing quite like this. The Chinese were advancing in what appeared to be endless numbers, their bugles and whistles creating an eerie soundtrack. To the battle, his platoon's position came under increasingly heavy fire. Levy knew that desperate measures might be required. The fighting continued throughout the afternoon and into the evening. The Chinese, following their standard tactics, would attack in waves, then withdraw to regroup before launching another assault. Each attack seemed to bring them closer to the Canadian positions, and Stone knew that his men were beginning to show the strain of continuous combat. As darkness fell, the tempo of the battle intensified. The Chinese preferred to attack at night, using the cover of darkness to mask their movements and to create confusion among the defenders. Stone had anticipated this and had positioned his men accordingly. But he also knew that night fighting would test his battalion's discipline and training to the limit. The wireless communications between the various company commanders crackled with reports of enemy activity. Baker Company, positioned on the eastern slope, reported heavy probing attacks. Charlie Company, defending the northern approach, was under constant mortar fire. But it was Dog Company, and particularly Lieutenant Levy's 10th platoon, that was bearing the brunt of the Chinese assault. Throughout the night, the sound of battle echoed across the Kapyong Valley. Flares lit up the darkness as both sides tried to illuminate their enemies, and the red tracers from machine gun fire created deadly light shows against the black sky. The Canadians, though vastly outnumbered, were holding their positions through a combination of superior firepower, excellent defensive positions, the kind of disciplined courage that had made the Canadian military legendary. As dawn approached on April 24th, Stone assessed his situation. His men had held through the night, but the Chinese pressure was intensifying. Intelligence reports suggested that even larger enemy forces were massing for a renewed assault. The real test of Canadian resolve was yet to come. Dawn on April 24th broke with deceptive calm, but Lieutenant Colonel Stone knew it was merely the eye of the storm. The Chinese forces had used the pre-dawn hours to reposition and reinforce, and intelligence reports indicated that they were preparing for their main assault. The 700 Canadians of the 2nd Battalion were about to face the full fury of what would prove to be one of the most intense battles of the Korean War. The renewed Chinese offensive began at first light with a massive artillery barrage. Shells rained down on the Canadian positions with unprecedented intensity, turning the rocky slopes of Hill 677 into a moonscape of craters and shattered stone. The earth trembled continuously as the bombardment continued, and Stone could only hope that his men's carefully constructed defensive positions would hold. In Dog Company's sector, Captain Wally Mills watched as the Chinese artillery systematically targeted his positions. The enemy had clearly identified his company as holding the key to the entire defensive line, and they were concentrating their firepower accordingly. Mills moved from position to position, encouraging his men and ensuring that ammunition was properly distributed. He knew that when the artillery lifted, the infantry assault would begin immediately. Lieutenant Mike Levy's 10th platoon was positioned on the most exposed part of the entire perimeter, a small knoll that jutted out from the main defensive line. From this position, they could provide flanking fire against any Chinese advance, but they were also isolated and vulnerable. As the artillery barrage intensified, Levy realized that his platoon was being specifically targeted. The Chinese had identified his position as crucial to their assault plans. The bombardment continued for what felt like hours, but was actually only 30 minutes. When it finally lifted, the silence was almost deafening. Then, from the slopes below, came the sound that every Canadian soldier had been dreading, the eerie wail of Chinese bugles and the shrill blast of whistles. The main assault was beginning. The Chinese emerged from the morning mist like ghosts, their brown uniforms barely visible against the rocky terrain. But there were so many of them that the entire slope seemed to be moving. Wave after wave of infantry advanced up the hill, their rifles and submachine guns chattering as they moved. The Canadian response was immediate and devastating. Every Brin gun on the hill opened fire simultaneously, their distinctive sound creating a deadly symphony. The Canadian riflemen, well-trained and disciplined, picked their targets carefully. The steep terrain forced the Chinese to advance in predictable patterns, and the defenders made them pay dearly for every yard gained. But still they came, driven by a combination of courage, ideology, and the knowledge that retreat was not an option. Private William Foster found himself in the center of the maelstrom, his rifle barrel smoking from continuous fire. Around him, his section was performing with mechanical precision, each man knowing his role and executing it flawlessly. The training they had received in Canada was paying dividends. But Foster could see that the sheer weight of numbers was beginning to tell. The Chinese tactics were both simple and effective. They would advance in waves, accepting massive casualties in the initial assault, then use the cover of their own dead to get closer to the Canadian positions. Each successive wave would advance a little further, and they were clearly prepared to continue this process until they either broke through or achieved their objective through sheer attrition. As the morning wore on, the situation became increasingly desperate. Stone could see that his men were beginning to show signs of fatigue, and ammunition was becoming a concern. The Chinese seemed to have unlimited reserves, and fresh troops were constantly being fed into the battle. The Canadian artillery was doing excellent work. It was clear that artillery alone would not be enough to stop the assault. The most critical moment came when a particularly large Chinese force managed to advance to within 50 yards of Lieutenant Levy's position. The 10th platoon was in danger of being overrun, and if that happened, the entire Canadian line would be compromised. It was at this moment that Levy made a decision that would be remembered as one of the most courageous acts of the Korean War. The situation on Hill 677 had reached its most critical point. Lieutenant Mike Levy, peering through the smoke and dust of battle, could see Chinese infantry advancing toward his position in overwhelming numbers. His 10th platoon, reduced to barely 24 men, was all that stood between the enemy and a breakthrough that could collapse the entire Canadian defensive line. Levy had fought in the Italian campaign during the Second World War, earning decorations for his courage under fire. But nothing in his previous experience had prepared him for this moment. The Chinese were advancing with the kind of determination that only desperate men possess, and they were willing to accept any casualties necessary to achieve their objective. Platoon's position on the forward knoll had become both a blessing and a curse. While it provided excellent fields of fire against the main Chinese advance, it also left them isolated and vulnerable to being surrounded. Levy could see Chinese soldiers moving through the terrain on both flanks, attempting to encircle his small force. "Sir," Corporal Davidson shouted above the noise of battle, "they're getting around us on the left." Levy could see the problem immediately. A squad of Chinese soldiers had managed to work their way through the rocky terrain and were now in position to attack his platoon from the side. If they succeeded in their flanking maneuver, the entire position would be compromised. The lieutenant knew that he had to act quickly and decisively. The wireless communication with battalion headquarters was becoming increasingly difficult as Chinese mortar fire targeted the Canadian command posts. Stone was aware that Levy's position was becoming untenable, but he also knew that abandoning it would likely result in the collapse of the entire defensive line. The 10th platoon would have to hold regardless of the cost. As the Chinese pressure intensified, Levy realized that conventional defensive tactics were no longer sufficient. The enemy was simply too numerous and too determined to be stopped by small arms fire alone. He needed to find a way to break up the attack before his position was overrun. It was then that he made the decision that would define his military career. Looking at the advancing Chinese forces, LeVay estimated that they were now close enough to his position to be vulnerable to artillery fire. The problem was that any artillery strike accurate enough to be effective against the enemy would also endanger his own men. It was a calculated risk that few officers would be willing to take. "Get me fire control," Levy shouted to his radio operator. When the connection was established, he calmly gave the coordinates for the artillery strike. But instead of targeting the Chinese positions, he gave his own location. "Are you sure about those coordinates?" the artillery controller asked, recognizing immediately what Levy was requesting. "Affirmative," Levy replied, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "We're about to be overrun. Fire for effect on my position." The decision to call artillery fire on his own position was one of the most dangerous gambles in military tactics. If the shells fell short, they would accomplish nothing. If they fell long, they might miss the enemy entirely. But if they fell exactly where Levy had requested, they would catch the Chinese forces at their most vulnerable moment, when they were concentrated for the final assault. The Canadian 25-pounder guns responded immediately. The shells came screaming in with devastating accuracy, exploding directly in front of the 10th Platoon's position. The Chinese advance, caught in the open and concentrated for their assault, was shattered by the artillery barrage. Bodies were thrown through the air, and the survivors scattered for whatever cover they could find. The gamble had worked, but at a cost. Several of Levy's own men had been wounded by shell fragments, and the position itself had been badly damaged. But the Chinese assault had been broken, and for the moment, the breakthrough had been prevented. The battle for Hill 677 would continue, but the most critical moment had passed. The artillery strike that Lieutenant Mike Levy had called down on his own position marked a turning point in the battle, but it did not end the Chinese assault. As the smoke cleared from the devastating barrage, it became apparent that while the immediate threat to the 10th Platoon had been neutralized, the enemy was already regrouping for another attack. Lieutenant Colonel Stone, monitoring the battle from his command post, realized that his battalion was facing a siege. The Chinese forces, estimated at over 5,000 men, had effectively surrounded the Canadian position on Hill 677. No supplies could reach the defenders, and medical evacuation of the wounded was impossible. The Canadians were entirely dependent on their own resources and the courage of their individual soldiers. Captain Wally Mills, commanding Dog Company, had witnessed Levy's courageous decision to call fire on his own position. As reports came in of the casualties suffered by the 10th Platoon, Mills knew that his company had to be prepared to hold the line with reduced numbers. The Chinese would inevitably exploit any weakness in the defensive perimeter. The battle had now been raging for over 24 hours, and the strain on the Canadian defenders was becoming apparent. Private William Foster, his face blackened with cordite and his uniform torn by shell fragments, continued to man his position despite exhaustion. Around him, his comrades showed the same determination, but Foster could see that everyone was reaching their physical and emotional limits. The Chinese tactics had evolved throughout the battle. Recognizing that direct frontal assaults were proving too costly, they had begun to use more sophisticated approaches. Small groups of infiltrators were attempting to work their way through the Canadian lines under cover of darkness, while larger forces kept up continuous pressure to prevent the defenders from repositioning. Throughout the day, Canadians were sustained by the knowledge that their sacrifice was serving a larger purpose. Intelligence reports indicated that the Chinese offensive was being held up across the entire front, largely due to the resistance being offered by the Commonwealth forces at Kapyong. Every hour that the Canadians held their position was an hour that allowed United Nations forces to reorganize and prepare their own counterattack. The wireless communications between the various company commanders had become the lifeline of the defense. Stone coordinated the battle from his command post, but he relied heavily on the reports from his company commanders to understand the tactical situation. The courage and professionalism of these junior officers was proving to be crucial to the successful defense. As night fell on April 24th, the Chinese renewed their assault with increased intensity. The enemy had clearly decided that the Canadian position had to be eliminated, regardless of the cost. Fresh troops were being fed into the battle, and the defenders could hear the sound of additional artillery being moved into position. The night fighting was particularly intense, because it negated many of the advantages that the Canadian position provided. The steep terrain that had favored the defenders during daylight became a liability in darkness, as Chinese infiltrators could use the cover of night to advance much closer to the Canadian lines. Flares were used continuously to illuminate the battlefield, but they also served to reveal the defenders' positions to enemy observers. Throughout the night, individual acts of heroism became commonplace. Sergeant Major Gordon Mackenzie, the battalion's senior non-commissioned officer, moved from position to position under fire, ensuring that ammunition was properly distributed and that wounded soldiers received medical attention. His calm presence and professional competence provided a stabilizing influence during the most chaotic moments of the battle. The medical personnel attached to the battalion performed their duties with exceptional courage. With no possibility of evacuating the wounded, they were forced to treat injured soldiers under fire in improvised aid stations. Their work was made more difficult by the shortage of medical supplies and the constant threat of Chinese infiltrators. As dawn approached on April 25th, Stone assessed his situation. His battalion had held through another night, but the casualties were mounting, and ammunition was becoming critically short. The Chinese showed no signs of reducing their pressure, and intelligence reports suggested that even larger enemy forces were being moved into the area. The ultimate test of Canadian resolve was approaching, the dawn of April 25th brought no relief to the embattled Canadians on Hill 677. If anything, the Chinese assault had intensified during the night, and Lieutenant Colonel Stone could see that his men were approaching the breaking point. The battalion had been under continuous attack for nearly 3 days, and the toll was becoming apparent in every aspect of their defense. The ammunition situation had become critical. Each company commander was reporting dwindling supplies, and Stone knew that without resupply, his men would soon be reduced to fighting with bayonets and whatever weapons they could capture from the enemy. The Chinese, seemingly aware of the defenders' predicament, were maintaining constant pressure to prevent any possibility of rest or reorganization. Captain Wally Mills, despite his own exhaustion, continued to move among his men, providing encouragement and ensuring that every available rifle remained in action. Dog Company had borne the brunt of the Chinese assault, and Mills could see that his soldiers were operating on pure determination. The wounded who could still fight remained at their positions. Those who could not were providing whatever support they could from the aid stations. Lieutenant Mike Levy's 10th Platoon, already reduced by casualties from the artillery strike. He had called on his own position, was holding a sector that had been repeatedly attacked throughout the night. The Chinese had clearly identified this position as crucial to their assault plans, and they were concentrating their efforts accordingly. Levy knew that his men could not hold much longer without reinforcement. The situation was complicated by the fact that the Chinese had managed to establish machine gun positions on the slopes below the Canadian perimeter. These weapons, positioned to provide covering fire for the attacking infantry, were making movement within the Canadian lines extremely dangerous. Any attempt to reinforce threatened positions or to evacuate wounded soldiers drew immediate and accurate fire. Private William Foster, one of the more experienced soldiers in his section despite his youth, had assumed additional responsibilities. As casualties mounted, his section commander had been wounded during the night, and Foster found himself directing the fire of the remaining men. The transformation from nervous recruit to combat veteran had occurred in the space of 3 days. Under the most extreme conditions imaginable, the Chinese assault tactics had evolved throughout the battle. Recognizing that direct frontal attacks were proving too costly, they had begun to use more sophisticated approaches. Small groups of infiltrators were attempting to work their way through the Canadian lines under cover of darkness, while larger forces kept up continuous pressure to prevent the defenders from repositioning their forces. Stone, monitoring the battle from his command post, realized that his battalion was facing annihilation unless something changed quickly. The Chinese forces showed no signs of reducing their pressure, and his own men were reaching the limits of human endurance. The wireless communications with higher headquarters had become sporadic, and Stone was unsure whether relief forces were being organized. The critical moment came when a large Chinese force managed to penetrate the Canadian perimeter between Baker and Charlie companies. The breakthrough threatened to split the Canadian defense in half, and Stone knew that if the enemy could exploit this penetration, the entire position would be compromised. The battalions reserve a handful of men who had been held back for just such an emergency was committed to seal the breach. The fighting for control of the breakthrough became the most intense of the entire battle. Hand-to-hand combat erupted as Canadian and Chinese soldiers fought for control of the rocky terrain. The superior training and equipment of the Canadian forces proved crucial in this close-quarters fighting. But the Chinese had the advantage of numbers and the momentum of their assault. As the battle raged, Stone received an unexpected message over the wireless. United Nations aircraft had been diverted to provide close air support for the Canadian position. The pilots, flying at extremely low altitudes to ensure accuracy, began to strafe the Chinese positions with machine gun fire and to drop napalm on the concentrations of enemy troops. The air support proved to be decisive. The Chinese, caught in the open and concentrated for their assault, suffered massive casualties from the aerial attacks. The momentum of their offensive was broken, and for the first time in 3 days, the defenders could sense that the tide of battle was turning in their favor. The arrival of United Nations air support marked the beginning of the end for the Chinese assault on Hill 677. The aircraft, flying dangerously low to avoid hitting the Canadian positions, delivered devastating attacks on the concentrations of enemy troops. The napalm strikes were particularly effective, creating walls of fire that broke up the Chinese formations and forced them to seek cover. Lieutenant Colonel Stone, watching the air attacks from his command post, allowed himself a moment of cautious optimism. For the first time in 3 days, his battalion was no longer fighting for its very survival. The Chinese assault, which had seemed unstoppable, was finally being contained. But Stone also knew that the battle was far from over, that the enemy would likely attempt one final, desperate assault. The respite provided by the air support allowed the Canadian companies to reorganize their defenses and to redistribute their remaining ammunition. Captain Wally Mills used the opportunity to consolidate his positions, moving his remaining men to the most defensible locations. The casualties in Dog Company had been severe, but the survivors were determined to hold their ground. Lieutenant Mike Levy, his face showing the strain of 3 days of continuous combat, assessed the condition of his 10th platoon. Half of his men had been killed or wounded, and those who remained were operating on pure determination. The artillery strike that he had called on his own position had saved the Canadian line. But it had also cost him some of his best soldiers. As the Chinese regrouped for what appeared to be their final assault, the defenders prepared for one last test of their resolve. The ammunition situation had improved slightly with the arrival of supplies dropped by aircraft, but Stone knew that his men were at the absolute limit of their endurance. They had been fighting continuously for 3 days, with minimal food, water, or rest. The final Chinese assault began at midday on April 25th. It was a coordinated attack involving all of the enemy forces in the area, and it was clear that the Chinese command had decided to commit everything to breaking the Canadian defense. The assault was preceded by the heaviest artillery barrage. Of the entire battle, the defenders could only huddle in their positions and wait for it to end. When the barrage lifted, the Chinese infantry emerged from their positions in even greater numbers than before. It seemed as if the entire valley was covered with advancing enemy soldiers, their bugles and whistles creating an almost deafening noise. The Canadian response was immediate and devastating, but it was also clearly the last effort that the defenders could make. The battle that followed was the most intense of the entire engagement. Every Canadian soldier who could hold a weapon was engaged in the fighting, including the wounded who had been evacuated to the aid stations. The Chinese, recognizing that this was their last opportunity to break through, fought with desperate courage. But the combination of superior defensive positions, disciplined fire, and the timely arrival of air support proved decisive. The turning point came when a large Chinese force, attempting to outflank the Canadian position, was caught in the open by a napalm strike. The casualties were massive, and the survivors scattered in all directions. The momentum of the assault was broken, and for the first time, Chinese began to withdraw from the battlefield. By evening on April 25th, the Battle of Kapyong was effectively over, the Chinese forces having suffered enormous casualties. In their attempts to break through the Canadian-Australian defense, were withdrawing from the area. The spring offensive that had threatened to drive the United Nations forces back to the sea had been halted. At least in this sector, the cost of victory had been high. According to Veterans Affairs Canada records, 10 Canadians were killed and 23 were wounded, a total that could be considered relatively light in view of the fierce fighting there, and a testament to the skill and organization of the defenders. The Chinese casualties were estimated at over 2,000, testament to the effectiveness of the Canadian defense. The Battle of Kapyong had demonstrated the exceptional courage and professional competence of the Canadian military. 700 men, vastly outnumbered and completely surrounded, had held their position against overwhelming odds. Their sacrifice had contributed significantly to the defeat of the Chinese spring offensive, and it helped, too, stabilize the United Nations line. The recognition of their achievement came in the form of a United States Presidential Unit citation, the first time such an honor had been awarded to a Canadian military unit. Individual decorations were also awarded, including a military cross for Captain Wally, Mills, and other honors for the officers and men who had distinguished themselves. During the Battle of Kapyong had ended, but its significance would be felt for years to come. The Canadian military had proven that it could hold its own against any enemy under any conditions. The men who had fought on Hill 677 had written a new chapter in the proud history of Canadian military service, one that would be remembered long after the last shot of the Korean War had been fired. The hill that had been defended so heroically would eventually be abandoned as the front lines shifted. But the memory of what had been accomplished there would endure. The Battle of Kapyong had shown that courage, determination, and professional competence could overcome even the most overwhelming odds. It was a lesson that would serve the Canadian military well in the years to come.